Hello and welcome back to Whiskey Uncorked. My name is Brian and we're going to be doing another whiskey review today. Today we're going to be focusing on the Smoky 12 from Benriach's core range. Now, I chose this particular bottle of whiskey because it's kind of following up and in some ways wrapping up a little bit of a theme that's taken place over the last handful of videos that I've posted on this channel. It all started with episode 3 of the Uncorked podcast, as I so lazily named it. Just some random videos that I shot with my brother over the holidays. And in the third episode, we talked about overrated and underrated whiskeys. Now that video led to my most recent review, Benriach 12, because I wanted to clarify for myself, and maybe some of you, what I really meant by saying it was overrated. I tried to explain it in the podcast video, but ultimately felt like it needed a little bit of clarification and to go on the record and say, hey, this is some really good whiskey, but I had some more convoluted reasons for naming it as one of my overrated. Now, on the flip side of that, Benriach The Smoky 12 and Benriach in general was labeled as one of my underrated whiskeys or underrated distilleries. And a lot of that stems from the fact that I had a really good experience with, not the specific bottle, but the Smoky 12 via a blind. It won the blind. I loved it. I pretty much went out and bought a bottle of it immediately. And it got put on my shelf next to some other core range bottlings, 10 to 12 years old. And that was right about the time that I started to get infatuated with independent bottlings and special releases, cast strength bottlings, that sort of thing. I kind of had this handful of core range releases just kind of hanging around, and they hung around for quite a while. Now, as this particular YouTube channel became more than just a vague idea in my mind, and I was becoming closer and closer to actually making videos, I decided it was a pretty good idea to make sure that I didn't completely fall out of touch with some of the core range bottlings that the vast majority of people out there were drinking. So I went and I bought a few bottles, and I looked towards that corner of my shelf that contained bottles like the Smoky 12 from Benriach. Anyways, I opened this up and started drinking it, and my first impressions were really positive. It seemed like, yeah, I wasn't too far off, that this was a really good whiskey. I was enjoying it, and it ultimately led towards, over the holidays, me saying that the Benriach is an underrated distillery, and specifically the Smoky 12 doesn't nearly get as much attention as it deserves. Now, as I actually sat down over the last week to do the review, my opinions changed somewhat. As I continued to drink this and I started to think about it on a little bit more of a critical level, I realized that there were things that weren't perfect about it or super wonderful. I was even finding some things that at times I didn't particularly like. So as it stands today, I feel like a little bit conflicted about this bottle. I still remember the times where I was really, really liking it, and maybe it's just I shouldn't think about it too much and should just sit back and kind of enjoy it and not pay attention to the little thing here or there that maybe I don't like so much. So I'm going to jump into the review, but we're going to talk a little bit more about Benriach and probably Glendronach and Glenglassaugh, maybe another distillery or two, because I think there's some similarities there. There's definitely similarities between the distilleries under the Brown-Forman umbrella that seem weird, and it's interesting to kind of talk about what that might lead to in 5 or 10 years. There's some other distilleries as well that kind of fall into this category, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Let's talk about the review. All right, so Benriach Distillery is located in Speyside. As I mentioned, it is owned by Brown-Forman currently. Famously, it was, prior to this, it was owned by Billy Walker and some other investors, where Billy Walker was acting as a master distiller and master blender. And he really put Glendronach in particular on the map by kind of relaunching some of the core ranges. And then obviously, even once Brown-Forman took over, there was a little bit of a gap based on some years where the distillery was mothballed, led to the 15, 18, 21-year-old having older stocks in it, and some really fantastic whiskeys that are even sought after quite a bit today. Benriach has an interesting history. Was opened back in 1898, or started distilling in 1898, only distilled for 2 years before the Pattinson crash happened, which is a topic that I am going to be looking into a little bit more. because it's super interesting. It's basically this crash specifically around the whiskey market in the UK, and it happened because of some overzealous whiskey investing and some unscrupulous characters, leading to a severe downturn in the whiskey market, leading to a number of closures, including Benriach, which was mothballed from 1900 to 1965. Now, the distillery wasn't completely shut down. The floor maltings were still in use, supplying its neighbor Longmore with barley. But it was reopened in 1965. I believe it was the Glenlivet Distillery group that reopened it. And in the 90s, they finally released their first single malt, as up till then, everything was used in blends. But they released a 10-year-old in the 90s, and unfortunately, the distillery was then mothballed again in 2002. Now, luckily, it didn't stay closed for nearly as long, as Billy Walker and his group of investors came in 2004, bought the distillery, and got the operation back up and running. So there was a period right after that where lots of different expressions of Benriach were being released. A bit of a flood. This is kind of similar to what happened with Bruichladdich, where some people bought the distillery, they looked at the stocks, there's some older stocks, they had a lot of eclectic casks, maybe casks that weren't really going to fit into their longer term plans, and they started releasing a lot of one-offs, a lot of special releases, single barrels, that sort of thing. All right, so as I mentioned, Benriach is in the Speyside area. It is a pretty large distillery. It's 2.8 million liters, which isn't massive, but it's a good-sized distillery. And they make both peated and unpeated spirit. This in particular is obviously a peated one, at being the Smoky 12. There's also the regular 12-year-old, there is a Smoky 10-year-old version, all of which are 46% ABV, and then there is a regular 10-year-old, which is at 43. Most recently, they have launched a 16-year-old, which is pretty decently priced in the US, kind of. It's about $110 plus tax, which for a 16-year-old isn't ridiculous these days, but it's starting to creep up there. This particular bottle sells for, I think I can get it for just under $60 before tax. The regular 12, it's a few dollars less than that. The prices seem to be fairly comparable in the UK, with slight differences in pricing between the peated and unpeated versions, and maybe a slightly less in terms of the direct exchange rate in the UK. All right, so let's talk about some nosing and tasting notes here. Now, as I mentioned, I came into this with some pretty high expectations. I've had some good experiences with this specific bottle and Smoky 12 in general, but that opinion has kind of morphed over the last week or two. All right, so on the nose, it's kind of what you expect. If I were to tell you a peated Speyside, it's got the traditional kind of Speyside, honey, floral, orchard, lemon, maybe a little grassy. All that's in there, but there is this kind of layer of peat that kind of sits on top of everything. And if you really can't do the Isla peat, this might be a good alternative for you. It is peaty, it's smoky, but it's definitely toned down from your big bad Islas. It's more of a clean smoke, a little less medicinal. You're not getting any of those kind of coastal briny qualities. You're not getting anything weird. It's a pretty clean smokiness throughout. And like I said, it's kind of sitting on top of what appears to be a fairly kind of, quote, pretty whiskey with some honey, floral, grass, some oak, that sort of thing. Overall, the nose is okay. It's not going to blow me. It doesn't blow me away. It's good. There's some layers there. There's some complexity, but I can already start to see the one thing that kind of turns me off a little bit. Turns me off is a little bit strong, but there's two distinct things happening here. There's a peat level, there's a peatiness, and then there's a Speyside whiskey. And those two things aren't really married together very well. And when I first started drinking whiskey, I didn't really understand this concept of being integrated or being one, coherent thing. And I think this is a whiskey that's a great example of something that is not integrated. It's doing one thing and another thing, and they're very distinct, and it's really kind of difficult to tell how one is affecting the other. Overall, though, the nose is solid. Like I said, there are some layers. You can dig around in there a little bit if you want, but ultimately you're not going to find anything too crazy or too weird. All right, let's go to the palate. Cheers. So on the front of the palate, you're getting hit with that Speyside character. There is honey, there's vanilla, and there's just a touch of kind of grassiness, florality, that sort of thing. But generally, kind of sweet, pretty light, almost maybe kind of refreshing. And then you swallow and you get hit with the expected peat. I would say the peat is pretty accurate, or the smokiness from the peat is pretty accurate to the nose, maybe even with a little surprising of a pop. But the experience carries over directly from the nose onto the palate, both in the notes that you're getting and in the overall experience. So again, you're getting a pretty good hit of peat. Maybe it's a little bit better integrated on the palate, but it does feel like you're still getting these two separate things, and the peat is much louder than the kind of Speyside whiskey that you're getting. That being said, there is honey all the way through. You're getting a nice maltiness. I almost didn't mention that this is made up of a vatting of bourbon, sherry, and Marsala casks. So it's giving it a somewhat unique combination of things going on. I don't think it's weird. I think the bourbon and Marsala almost seem to make more sense. Sherry-wise, I don't seem to be getting a ton of like sherry-like notes. I can tell that from a fruitiness, we're getting some of that orchard and citrus, primarily lemon. Overall, you are getting this similar experience of smoky peat, elegant, tasty, but if maybe unremarkable Speyside Scotch, right? At least for me, Speyside Scotch is kind of the honey, floral, grassy whiskey. That's what Scotch was at one point in my life. That's just that, or it was super smoky and hard to drink. Now you're getting a little bit of both of those, and it's not really making up its mind. All right, I'm gonna do one more sip on the palate, and then we'll get into my final thoughts and the score, and then move on to some of my broader thoughts about Benriach in general. Yeah, I like the front of the palate, then it gets a little weird and squirrely in the middle, but not bad. And then the finish is kind of where I think things truly kind of fall apart. Fall apart's a strong word, but where the flaws start to become evident. Some of that sweetness kind of dies off, and you start to get left with a little bit of a dry oak, a touch of bitterness, which in and of itself isn't a problem. But you're getting a note that comes out more, and not in a good way, when you add water. And it starts to almost have like a artificial sweetener, high fructose corn syrup sort of vibe to it. It's kind of sour, kind of sweet, but not really either of those things. It's a very distinct flavor that I'm not exactly sure how to describe, but it leaves a bit of a residue in your mouth, and that really comes out when you add water, even though I think when you do add water, the overall experience that I was complaining about before with things not being integrated well gets a lot better. But there's that specific note that comes out more strongly when you add water. And I think I notice it more now since the first time I added water to this, and I'm like, what is that flavor? And I had to think about it, and the closest thing I could come to was like, I don't drink a lot of soda anymore these days. I used to drink a lot of it, both regular and then diet, and I've mostly cut that out. The occasional can of Coke here, and when I do drink it, it leaves just a weird aftertaste. And it's almost certainly that high fructose corn syrup, or corn syrup that we get here in the States. It's not nearly as bad if you were able to find some natural sugar Coke, but yeah, it's just it's not a pleasant flavor, to be honest. Man, I'm conflicted about this whiskey. I've had really good experiences with this bottle overall. The more I drink it and the more I think about it critically, like I said, the less I tend to enjoy it. Now, in terms of a score, I came into this thinking it was probably going to get a 7 out of 10, which would put it in the very good category on my rating scale. But it didn't take long before I was thinking like, no, you know what, that's probably not actually a 7. This is going to be more of a 6, which would be very good. And really, honestly, in the last day or so, since I've kind of been doing my final thoughts on this and really trying to decide where it falls in the grand scheme of things, I don't think I can give it more than a 5. Now 5 is average, and average I mean average in terms of good whiskey. Really, this is where this should fall. 5s are going to, generally speaking, be well presented, 46%, full flavored, entry level, core range, introductory sort of whiskeys to, not just introductory to a new drinker or something, but to a brand. Now, generally, the consensus on this, like I said, I thought, in my mind, Benriach doesn't get talked about enough. This bottle should get more attention. So I went and I looked and was like, what are people saying? And there's a pretty wide range. It seems to range from it's pretty good, it's solid, it's a good value, there's some interesting things happening here, down to I don't like this. And I can see why somebody might not like this bottle. My tastes have changed a lot, even in this half of a bottle here. It just ends up feeling a little bit empty in spaces. There's some flavors that don't really come up or don't really match up. It's not integrated well. I was gonna say there's some flavors I don't like. And again, if I just pour a glass of this, sit back and drink it, I can actually have a pretty enjoyable experience. But sitting there super focused on it, I think some of the flaws start to show. So I do think this is, at the end of the day, an interesting, solid whiskey. I think it's a good introduction to kind of non-Isla peat. Again, I think some of the flavors overall are a little bit, the dials are turned a little bit differently, as I like to say, or they're a little bit off. Could use some tweaking. But average, I'm comfortable with a 5 out of 10 average. I think it can be better for sure. But it's not bad. And this seems to be kind of where most other reviewers have it, depending on their rating scale. You can see things in the low 80s and maybe the mid 80s if it's a 100 point scale. But if you listen to the actual words and don't just pay attention to the score, most people say, yeah, it's not bad, it's pretty good. And then you're getting a handful of folks that say, don't recommend it. All right, so one thing I didn't really mention was its presentation, and I wanted to save that for last because this is where things get a little bit strange. So it is bottled at 46%. Benriach does not use coloring in any of its whiskeys, as far as anyone knows, although it does not state that on the bottle. But they do seem to chill filter, at least to some degree. Now, this is similar to GlenDronach. GlenDronach infamously removed their non-chill filtered statement from their packaging a couple years ago. Many people were upset. It's still somewhat unclear as exactly what has changed. There's an article over on dramface.com that kind of explains a little bit more in depth of at least what GlenDronach is saying has changed, which is not much at all. They're just trying to be more compliant with various regulations, particularly the Scotch Whisky Association. So Benriach seems to maybe suffer from the same fate. I don't think the whiskey is necessarily obviously overly thin. There is some oiliness. There's a little bit of viscosity. It seems pretty average for a whiskey of this type. But they're almost certainly chill filtering some or all of their whiskey, at least in their core range, and the extent of that chill filtration, as always, is relatively unknown. But in this case, it's probably not overly aggressive, as it is 46% ABV. So we see a theme here, both on the palate and in what Benriach seems to be trying to be, and that is they're not really committing to anything. It's a peaty whiskey, it's a Speyside whiskey, but those two things just don't really mesh well. And kind of on the enthusiast side of things, 46% natural color, but it's chill filtered, probably, sometimes, maybe all the time, not sure. It just won't commit to being something. And it doesn't seem to mesh well when they do that. So it led me to a broader conversation because Brown-Forman, at least in terms of their Scotch whiskey portfolio, which consists of GlenDronach, Benriach, and Glenglassaugh, who has just released a 12-year-old whiskey, much to the excitement of the enthusiast community, as this is a distillery that's been kind of in a revival mode, a relaunch, a new future. They released their 12-year-old age-stated whiskey, and it's 45%. Now, 45% in terms of ABV and strength, not that big of a deal. It's 1%, who cares? But if you're a longtime enthusiast, you know that 46% is kind of that cutoff for when, below 46%, distilleries need to chill filter things. I hate it when people say that because no, they don't need to. The reason they say that is because there's a certain audience that wants lower ABV whiskey, and they expect it to stay clear on ice or with water or just at lower temperatures, which leads you to wonder, why are you doing it at 45%, which means you're almost certainly chill filtering. And if you're chill filtering at 46% above the line where you don't need to, then you're almost certainly doing it for your 45% whiskey. And at that point, why don't you just lower the ABV further? It just doesn't make sense. Who are you selling whiskey to? Who are you catering to? And it seems like Brown-Forman doesn't really know. Now, there's part of me that said, well, that's going to spell trouble for them at some point down the line. In my opinion, in the next 5 to 10 years, it's likely we're going to see some turbulence in the whiskey industry, both globally and maybe specifically in Scotch. As the rest of the world continues to make more whiskey, more aged stocks, they get better at it, there's more options, even here in the US, like the amount of whiskey and the categories of whiskey and the quality of whiskey that's available, even the stuff that's not highly allocated and not highly sought after, is just getting better and better and better. And when you look at Scotch whiskey, and they have their fair share of new distilleries opening up all the time, both distilleries launching new whiskeys and new distilleries breaking ground. You've seen massive expansions at many of the very large distilleries. You've had entire whiskey manufacturing meccas like Rose Isle being built by Diageo, just able to pump out any kind of whiskey at any time, at massive scales. And you have to start to wonder, who's going to buy all this? What are they going to be willing to pay for it? And at some point, particularly some of these smaller distilleries, aren't going to make it. Now, Benriach is not a small distillery, and they're backed by one of the largest drinks distributors in the world. They're backed by the owners of Jack Daniels and all these other massive drinks companies all over the world, massive distribution networks. So, look, Benriach and Glendronach aren't going to go out of business anytime soon. But you do have to wonder that if things do start to get a little rough, there's a downturn, even if it's not as bad as the 80s and 90s, where do these distilleries fall? If it's the mass market that is really going to be the ones that feel the downturn, and a good chunk of enthusiasts are still sticking around, but obviously we're a little bit more of the high margin spenders, although we make up a pretty small slice of the market overall. What happens to these distilleries that have kind of said, hey, we're not completely forgetting about you, but we're not really ready to commit? Another distillery that seems to kind of do this, but does it maybe a little bit better, is Benriach. Right? They have the constant complaining about their core range being 43% chill filtered. I'm right there with you. It's frustrating because it's like, we know how good that will be if you just, it's already really good. It's already probably worth buying. But if you just gave it to us just a little bit better, like it feels like it would just become the belle of the ball and just take off. Now, they seem to refuse to do that, and I think they've openly said we're not going to do that because we win a lot of awards with our whiskey as it is, which is frustrating. These people being Gordon and MacPhail, who, as independent bottlers, are no strangers to unchill filter natural color releases, but what they do give us is they have given us a pretty diverse range of releases, both cast strength and otherwise, special releases, annual releases that are 46% or cast strength, non-chill filtered, natural color, with the only downside maybe being a lack of higher age statements, which, let's be real, they're probably going to be priced to a point where most people can't buy them anyways. So you have Benriach kind of playing both sides of the fence, but being maybe a little bit more transparent about things. And then you have Brown-Forman and their stable of distilleries in Glendronach, Benriach, and Glenglassaugh, who like I said, it just doesn't seem to make sense. It's almost like you want them to commit one way or the other. And maybe that's what they're doing is smart. Maybe they see some turbulence coming. They want to try to keep making everyone happy. They don't want the enthusiasts to completely abandon them. They don't want to accelerate the problems that might be coming by turning off certain markets that expect their whiskey to be clear, even on ice. And maybe what they're doing is actually smart in the long term. They are one of the largest drink sellers in the world, after all. So it's difficult to say you don't know what you're doing, that you don't understand your own marketplace. They obviously do. It just can be frustrating for us. So anyways, this is something I want to keep an eye on going forward. And I think there's a lot of room for these conversations. And there have been many online content makers that have already broached this subject. What's going to happen with all of these new distilleries, this explosion that the global whiskey market has experienced over the last 5-10 years, and really maybe even before that with the slower ramp-up process. What is this going to culminate in? Where does it end? Because it will end. What's at the end? Is it a massive drop-off? Is it a slow tapering? What happens? Like, how many of these distilleries are going to go out of business? Here in the United States, there was this massive craft beer explosion, and all it took was the craft cocktail industry and the whiskey business and bourbon just to take a decent uptick, and all of a sudden you had all of these new little brewery operations that before were able to pay their rent and stay afloat and keep people employed. Suddenly that small little uptick, and there was a mass exodus, a mass closing of a lot of these, very small operation distilleries, and even some of the bigger ones. One of the problems with some of the larger breweries, at least I'm not an expert, but at least it seemed to me, is they became big enough where the craft beer drinkers started to ignore them. There wasn't enough innovation happening. They were just releasing the same things all the time. They were bought out by some of your larger brewing companies like InBev and Miller Coors and that sort of thing. So the craft beer drinkers turned their way. And your traditional American light lager drinkers, Bud Light, Miller Lights, Coors Light, whatever, weren't going to drink the hipster beers that they viewed these breweries as being, and would always view them as being. They're going to stick to their good old American, light lagers and screw anybody that suggests otherwise. Is that going to happen to a company like Benriach or Glendronach, who's kind of playing the middle of the road? Maybe. It could. But it seems like it's not happening yet. There's pretty open transparency about financials for some of these distilleries, and it looks like, at least in the most recent one, from the fiscal year 2022 compared to fiscal year 2023, which ended in April of last year, so we should be getting another one of these pretty soon. The profits before taxes of Benriach just alone raised from 17 million pounds all the way up to like 22 million pounds. It was a difference of 30%. It was a 30% year-over-year increase in terms of annual profits. I think after taxes, it was up even a little bit more than that. It was like 33% increase. So clearly they're not having any issues making money. Does that gravy train last forever? It's impossible to know. I'm not the one that's going to solve the problem, but it does raise some questions like, are people loving Benriach? Is there good marketing? Has there been an increase in distribution to new areas of the world? I didn't dig into it that far, but it does seem like the company is healthy. There's healthy stocks. They are doing well, as is Glendronach and Glenglassaugh with their their newly formed range, I'm sure, is attracting a lot of attention and has gotten some good reviews outside of that kind of weird 12-year-old. All right, so lots of questions left unanswered. A lot of interesting things coming up, happening here in the next 5 to 10 years, globally and in specifically the Scotch whiskey world. What do you think? How do you see this playing out? Maybe you have more information than I do, especially being in the U.S. It's, you have to really go look for this information. You're not going to come across it in your local newspaper for the distillery down the street. But yeah, it's really interesting, and I do hope that Benriach and Glendronach do well, because they do make good whiskey, and I don't think there's any doubt about that. And yeah, it would be great if they just went that little extra step and made whiskey that we don't have to nitpick and we don't have to try to pull apart because of some weird decision made in a boardroom somewhere. All right, but that's going to do it for me today. Thanks again for tuning in. Again, please leave a like, hit subscribe, leave a comment, let me know what you think. And I've really been appreciating all of the support I've been getting through, like the likes and the comments. And we're in the final stretch, maybe to 100 subscribers, which, hey, it's not many, but it's a lot more than I thought I'd have at this point, to be honest. So thank you guys so much. And until next time, cheers.